Good morning to all viewers and listeners and other attendants out there in the World Wide Web, wherever you may be. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Since this is a breakfast forum here at the Bergen Global, we hope that you have something nice to munch on, that you're one of the lucky ones to have that, or perhaps even a cup of coffee, as I do. My name is Aslak Orre. I'm a political scientist and a researcher here at the Christian Michelsen Institute. The Bergen Global is a cooperation between the Christian Michelsen Institute and the University of Bergen. And I was honored with the task of chairing this morning's meeting, the breakfast forum, that will focus or return the spotlight on Venezuela. And when we say return, it is because we have had quite a few debates and talks about Venezuela here at the Bergen Global for the last 5 or 6 years, and today's participants have also been part of that. I also say return because we haven't had one for a while. So the conveners here at the Bergen Global said that the previous seminars about Venezuela had attracted a lot of attention and participation, but since the last one, more than a year ago, things have gone somewhat quiet in the media about Venezuela. But more than anything, it is the exceptional, dramatic, and grueling and globally important state of affairs in Venezuela that in and of itself merits our engaged academic attention on it. Venezuela has not disappeared from the international media attention because the crisis is over or because things have calmed down. To the contrary, the combined effects of political, economic, social, and even environmental crisis are continuing to send more migrants out of the country, joining the ranks of the already 5 to 7 million people who have left the country in the last decade or so. I'm therefore happy that 2 brilliant Latin Americanist scholars, 2 of Norway's most knowledgeable, consistent, and eloquent communicators about Venezuela, will share their thoughts today. One is Benedicte, who is professor at the Center for Development and Environment in Oslo, and she will be with us on the screen in a moment, I hope. And the other one is Leiv Marsteintredet, who is professor at the Department of Comparative Politics here at the University of Bergen. We shall start with Benedicte, who will focus on economic and social development over the last few years, and then move over to Leiv, who will focus on political developments. And I've asked you, the 2 of you, to start with about a 10-minute introduction before we move over to question and answer sessions. And we hope we will be able to take some questions from the audience in the Q&A chat part of the Zoom meeting. And we'll also, towards the end, touch on the relationship between Norway and Venezuela. But first, Benedicte, would you like to give your presentation?
Thank you very much, and thank you for those words. I was thinking of just giving a very, very brief overview over some economic developments, basically since 2019, when the world's attention was on Venezuela with the with the announcement of Juan Guaidó that he was the legitimate president of Venezuela. I've prepared a brief presentation. Of course, I'm not going to be able to touch on all the aspects of economic and social development. So this is some of the aspects that I think are more important, also for the prospect of a successful solution to the crisis. So let us see here. This is just, I was in Venezuela last time was in February last year. Since then, so I've not been able to go for obvious reasons because of the pandemic. And that is, of course, also an important backdrop to anything that we discuss here, but I'm not going to go particularly into it. This is just some of the very contrasting photos I took at that occasion. Huge lines for gasoline, This photo is not from Caracas, it's from out of Caracas, as a booming kind of parallel economy in some of the major city centers, but also the regular poor markets where prices are increasingly completely incomprehensible. Of course, the economic crisis did not start in 2019. It also, and I'll get back to that, did not start in 2017 with the sanctions. It starts much earlier. Around 2012, we see some major signs of weakness and the start of the economic crisis, actually, although it wasn't felt really until like 2015. Currently, the Venezuelan economy has shrunk by 3/4 since Maduro took power. That's something that's almost incomprehensible. We haven't actually seen it even in some of the worst wars around the globe. This is all just a different way of looking at it, and we see negative figures also basically unseen anywhere else than in Venezuela. A negative growth of 5% is usually seen as pretty dramatic, and Venezuela is talking about an annual negative growth up to -40, and this is before the pandemic. Part of the reason for this is, of course, a dramatic drop in Venezuela's oil production. Venezuela has been an oil-producing country and completely dependent on oil income for many decades, but both the prices dropped in 2014-15, as all of us here in Norway also probably know, but Venezuelan oil production has been on a negative trend for quite a while, but it has dropped much more steeply lately, starting also way before 2019, way before 2017, but starting actually in the mid-2000s. But we see that the drop has been much steeper as of late. Part of this complete crisis is a result of a combination of different policies that led to inflation. I'm going to go a little bit more into it. That led to hyperinflation. We reached hyperinflation in late 2017. That means that inflation is more than 1,000% a year. It has dropped now, but there's very little transparency in how much it has dropped. As you see, this is my kind of amateur way of, to the right here, my amateur way of trying to make a graph with numbers that are so disparate that it just looks like a mess. But it shows also that the Banco de Venezuela, Banco Central de Venezuela, they're operating with very different numbers than the IMF, which is the orange curve here. Just some very, very kind of broad ideas of how Venezuela's economic crisis looks in graphs. One of the major problem with the drop in oil income for Venezuela is that they're producing very, very little not much other things, and the production of that has also dropped steadily over the years. This is an overview over the import of goods and services. It shows that it peaked around 2012, or just before the 2013 election campaign, actually, when Maduro was elected first time, and then it drops steeply, starting here around 2012. It actually picks up a little bit after 2017 for a variety of reasons, and I don't have newer numbers than around 2018, but it continues more or less in this area. And that, of course, has a direct impact on people's both the inflation, the general drop in economic growth has a direct impact on people's living conditions. These are numbers from the ENCOVI, which is a survey conducted by the 4 major universities in the country on the extent to which people are able to buy the basic food and cover their their other necessities. If we start with the kind of most positive part of this graph is that the percentage of households that live in moderate poverty has dropped a little bit, and that is because the percentage that lives in extreme poverty has increased, and currently almost everybody is considered to live in poverty, if counting their income. And we'll see in a minute why that is so, because basically wages are worth nothing anymore. Wages in bolívares, in the national currency. And that also means that a high percentage of the population does not have sufficient food. So just some very, very brief numbers. If we look at the reasons for this, there's no time to go into all of this, but I would say that the main kind of reasons for the economic disaster in Venezuela currently is first, it's the political situation with a complete conflict between the government and the private sector, and those that controlled first the oil company, but especially the whole productive apparatus, then a number of failed policies, including the takeover of companies and farms. But for the kind of long-term development of the Venezuelan economy, I would particularly emphasize the law of price and currency controls, which created a very distorted economic regime in Venezuela, making subsidizing dollars to companies to import, while controlling the prices for the reason that they should avoid those subsidies just to be pocketed by the owners of the companies, of course. But in the end, it created a system in which it was first very politicized who got the dollars, but second, it didn't really pay much off to produce in Venezuela. And then with huge expenses for the government to lots of, some of them very good social programs, but also flowing out in corruption, flowing out of various other failed projects. The government started to print money to cover the deficits, and that starts to pick up around 2012, and that's why I would say that the crisis really starts here in 2012, when the government starts to print money, and then with a drop in oil prices, then they have to continue that even more rapidly. And then you get, with a drop in oil prices, you get demonstrations, you get shortages. That's when we saw all the photos from Venezuela with empty shelves and no access to toilet paper, et cetera, et cetera. And then come the sanctions. One of the major changes that have happened since 2019, I would say, is that the sanctions have, the effect of the sanctions have really started to hit. And second, that the government has embarked on what I would call a kind of perverted neoliberal strategy. And I will show you what I mean with that. If we take the issue of sanctions first, there's a huge debate about the effect of sanctions, what they have cost and what they have not cost. I'll try to summarize that very briefly. And I would actually say that among most researchers, there isn't that much discussion anymore. One thing that is important to keep in mind, that we're talking about very, very different measures here. The first sanction was imposed on Venezuela in 2006, a weapon embargo that did not have any other consequence actually than making Venezuela a very close ally to Russia. I'm talking here mainly about the sanctions from the United States, not those imposed by the EU and others. They're actually not very, they don't have much effect. Then comes a number of what we call individual sanctions against specific persons in the regime. Some were sanctions due to human rights abuses, some sanctions due to drug trafficking. In 2015, there was a special kind of a law in the United States that allowed individuals that were both involved in human rights abuses, but also that were a threat to democracy to be sanctioned. All of these are individual sanctions. They do not have much effect on the economy. Then in 2017, August, the financial sanctions were imposed that prevented Venezuela from getting new loans to refinance their debt. That had some effect. And then it's kind of the nuclear option that comes in January 2019, the oil sanctions. Also gold, but that prevents Venezuela to sell their oil. And given that around 95% of their income is from oil, this has major impacts. And then comes sanctions against transactions with the government. In 2020, there was no new sanctions imposed, but there was an end of several exceptions. And the most important was the one that Trump left just after he left. And that was the end of what they called crude for diesel swaps that allowed Venezuela to import diesel to run their trucks that carry around food in the country. So what, and of course, a lot of other things, but that's the most crucial one. Now, what did that cost? First, of course, it did not cause the crisis. Individual sanctions has minimal effect on the economy, but starting from 2017, it aggravated the crisis in the oil sector, it deepened the economic crisis, but most important, I think, or among the most important effects is that it deepened informalization and the criminalization of the economy. I'll get a little bit back to that. It also strengthened ties with Russia, Turkey, Iran, and others, and it definitely complicated humanitarian aid.
Yeah. Benedicte?
Yeah?
Can I stop you there and ask you to take any further points in the discussion later?
Could I just do one more slide? Is that possible?
Yep.
Okay, I'm just gonna, because some of the reactions to all of this from the government is what I would call the emergence of Venezuelan 21st century capitalism. They have run a program that a kind of politicized deregulation of prices and currencies, gradual dollarization of the economy, privatization of companies, and a de facto decentralization of the control. It also has just deep cuts in public expenses and exceptions from tariffs, which is kind of the neoliberal recipe, just wrapped in state control. And if we just see one of those kind of measures, you see here the reduction of minimum wages, which is here is a comparison with other countries that have been sanctioned, and we see Venezuela is they've almost eradicated the value of their minimum wages. All of this just to say that I think that this economic situation that has emerged is in part an economy that's no longer fueled by oil, but fueled by a number of different criminal activities, including large-scale money laundering schemes. So just leaving that for the discussion of further developments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benedicte. That was a true tour de force of the economic developments during the last 10 years or so. Before turning over to Leiv, I have just one question to eke out the big picture here. And that is about inequality. You briefly touched upon that in the beginning, and as you mentioned, the rampant neoliberal turn after in the last few years or so. We know that inequality is strongly associated with such policies, and or at least has been famously so. What do you make of this? That one of Chavismo's main tropes was that Venezuela's old elite had failed to share the wealth of the country with the people. But now, after 22 years in power, not only is poverty higher, but it also seems, judging from the affluent shopping centers and restaurants in some of the Venezuelan cities, that some people have become really, really rich and are still being that, as a sure sign of inequality. So how to explain that? Who is this rich elite now? Is it the old elite that has remained somehow, or is it the sign of a new Chavista ruling class, or is it both?
Yeah, I had a video that I didn't have time to show that is from a just impressive new supermarket in Caracas. That's unbelievable. We don't have anything like it in Norway.
Okay, is the video long?
But sorry?
How long is the video?
1 minute.
That's, yeah.
We'll
make it available for viewers later. Okay.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, especially you see enormous amount of flashy new buildings, new supermarkets. You see new cars. I've heard reports of Teslas running around in Caracas now. I haven't seen that myself, but I think it's both. For example, the mystery of the bodegones, this huge shopping center where you pay basically in dollars. There's stuff that's directly imported from the United States. It's not a mystery that they appear that they can import, because private persons are allowed to import directly from the United States, partly with exemptions of tariffs. So you get it's not even unpacked. I found actually a Norwegian salmon in one of those with the Norwegian wrapping. It said norsk laks I porsjonsstykker. So it's not even repacked to be sold in Venezuela. But the mystery is who's buying this, because the prices are varied. Not everything is super expensive. Lots of it is really expensive, and compared to the wages that Venezuelans get, it's kind of completely out of their possibility to buy it. But so the explanation, to some extent, this can be understood as kind of a money laundering machine, because some of the stuff that's imported is imported with funds that was stacked abroad by both the Chavista elite, but also the old elite that sent money abroad when they had no confidence in the government, which happens everywhere in Latin America, actually. And some of the money that people are buying this with comes from different illegal activities. So, but there's also a lot of new, so it's partly old elite that's kind of finding new ways of surviving under hard pressure and very unpredictable conditions, but it's also new elites. It's new domestic elites, many of them connected to the military or somewhat else connected to the government, but also new international elites. You have things coming in from particularly Turkey, Iran, but also a lot of neighboring countries. So there's kind of, it's partly a renewal of the old elite and partly new elites emerging in Venezuela, I would say.
Sort of creates a nice bridge to the political situation. So, Leiv, would you give us?
Yeah, thank you, Benedicte, for this introduction as well. I think it's important that when I speak about the main political issues, that the context of a economic, social, and also humanitarian crisis that's been ongoing for some years is present in the minds of the viewers and listeners. It's not like the dealings between the opposition and the regime for the last 5-6 years have happened in a vacuum. The desperation of a democratic opposition is, of course, explained largely by the situation that Benedicte has been talking about now. So I will talk mainly about the opposition and the opposition's various strategies to win power since 2015. One reason is that I think it plays into the issue of negotiations that we'll come back to later, And also it gives a slight background for the current situation, which has basically ended a political cycle that started in 2015. Now, any democratic organized actor is really interested in winning power. We know that from political science, and they have a different set of tactics and strategies to win that power. Most preferably, any democratic actor wants to win power through elections. When they can't win power through elections, if they're desperate enough, they try to influence politics by turning to the streets, mobilizing the streets. Both of these are civilian ways of doing politics and legal ways of doing politics. However, if mobilization in the streets do not work, actors may turn to illegal or more violent means of winning power. Another way of winning power is, of course, through military coups. We also have insurrections and even assassinations as a way to win power. Now, these are, I mentioned these in an order of desperation, from low levels of desperation to high levels of desperation. And we've seen all of these tactics actually employed by different actors in Venezuela over the last 6 years. I think it's important to have that in mind when I briefly go through what the tactics of the opposition have been, and then we will discuss this further in the question and answers. Now, I mentioned that today we're seeing the end, we've seen the end of a political cycle that started with the opposition's victory in the parliamentary election in 2015. Back then, the opposition won 2/3 of the seats in parliament, and it started a period of hope for a turnover in power in Venezuela, hope for a democratic victory after many years of Chavismo that had turned more and more authoritarian. And it started really a period that further polarized the Venezuelan society, but also a period that saw a lot of conflicts. Now, this period ended in December 2020 when Chavismo, or the Socialist Party, won about 90% of the seats in parliament. This has basically ended these 6 years, or 5 to 6 years, of constant attempts by the opposition to get the Maduro out of power. And I'll go slightly through this period because it talks to, I think, also the chances of having a negotiation succeed, at least chances of having a negotiation succeed that brings a change of power in Venezuela. Now, back in 2015, in years coming up to December 2015, the opposition had gained new hope for winning power through elections, mainly caused by the death of Hugo Chavez, who was impossible to beat basically in elections. But with Maduro, a weaker leader, or that's what people thought at the time, gave hopes for an electoral strategy, and the opposition united, and by surprise for many, managed to win 2/3 majority in parliament. Now, the 2/3 victory was extremely important because that basically, according to the constitution, gave the opposition all power. They had basically, even if they didn't win the presidency, they could gain the presidency by following the letter of the constitution. They could alter the constitution, they could alter the composition of the Supreme Court, they could alter the electoral authorities, and through some constitutional steps, they could also remove Maduro. It was a game changer in Venezuela at the time, but it also meant a huge test for the Venezuelan regime at the time. Back in 2015, we were still uncertain. Are we talking about a democratic regime that will accept a loss in an election? Or are the critics right? Venezuela has been authoritarian for a long time. So it was a huge test of the democratic intentions of Maduro and his regime. And it was a test that the regime failed. 2015 brought a situation that where Maduro and democracy could not survive at the same time. It ended with democracy dying and Maduro surviving in power. Because instead of accepting the loss of a parliamentary election, the regime responded with harsh autocratization, increasing authoritarian measures, and closing democratic channels and arenas by each opposition attempt to win power. So for instance, after the opposition won parliamentary power, the regime through the Supreme Court denied 3 opposition members to take seat in parliament. Then the Supreme Court declared basically all parliamentary action for unconstitutional. Later on, the regime created a constituent assembly to write a new constitution. What it really did was to take up legislative power instead of the regular parliament. So basically how the regime responded to losing control over parliament was to shut it down, if not physically, at least de facto. So the first result of the parliamentary election in 2015 was that the democratic arena was closed. Parliament was basically closed. Now, the opposition continued with electoral strategies through the call for a referendum, using the Chavista constitution against Chavez in a way to, or against Maduro, sorry, in a way to try to recall Maduro's mandate. Again, the regime responded by closing a democratic arena, this time the electoral arena, by declaring that the collection of signatures to call for a recall referendum that would basically fire Maduro was unconstitutional. So now, back in 2016, coming into 2017, both parliament and the electoral arena were closed as effective democratic channels in Venezuela. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, if democratic channels are closed, the opposition do not, or democratic actors do not stop and try, but they turn to other strategies. And of course, what happened was that the opposition turned to the streets. Seeing that institutional channels were closed off, mass demonstrations ensued. But that also meant a different response from the regime, whereas previously the regime could be more civil about closing off democratic channels. This also meant harsher repression of regular people, harsher repression of politicians. We saw mass arrests, we saw selective arrest, and we've seen torture, and also some selective killings when met with mass demonstrations throughout basically 2016 and 2017. So at the end of 2017, having responded to a large mobilization by the Venezuelan people, basically all democratic arenas or all channels of democratic influence, be that institutional or through popular pressure, were closed off. Now, this had 2 negative effects for the opposition, or they had more, but basically 2. The opposition, in order to mobilize people, had to promise success, but it couldn't deliver on those promises. The opposition promised all the time, in order to mobilize the people, that we will get Maduro out of power. They failed, which of course weakened the opposition and demobilized both the organized opposition and its supporters. And also, having seen that attempts at parliamentary action, attempts at the electoral action, and attempts at using the streets created a split in the opposition over strategies, and it led to more undemocratic or desperate measures. As we've seen, there have been coup attempts in 2019, there was a failed so-called invasion attempt, and so on and so forth. And becoming more radical, so to speak, also splits the opposition, because they couldn't unite totally on these more radical measures of winning power. In 2019, however, the opposition had then been with its back broken for a year or 2. They saw a new hope, so to speak, with a new attempt to topple Maduro. This time with expressed international support, and the attempt was also negotiated and coordinated with the United States and other neighboring countries of Venezuela. It was a last desperate measure to win power that ended in the months before the parliamentary election in 2020. The reasonable backdrop for this was, of course, that in 2018 there had been a presidential election that the main opposition parties had boycotted. The opposition learned from the 2015 election and the aftermath that running in elections wouldn't give them power, so they boycotted. But this election was declared invalid by Parliament, and the opposition argued then that it was the president of Parliament at that time, Juan Guaidó, who was the rightful president of Venezuela, because not having had a valid or legal election, this means that it's the parliamentary president that takes over as interim president until new fair democratic election can be called. Now, to my surprise, because this was a very legalistic argument, this argument got traction, it got international support, and we saw again a rise of mobilization in the streets in order to press Maduro out. But by reasons of self-inflicted wounds, by not being successful, by trying a coup attempt in mid-2019, the opposition again failed and split and resulted weakened after this strategy. Now, this strategy has been, the Guaidó strategy met a lot of criticism, because by declaring Guaidó internationally as the rightful president of Venezuela, you've kind of stepped up the international pressure, and it becomes harder to say that, well, we'll negotiate with Maduro, we can talk with Maduro. If you do not, it's harder to say that when you do not recognize him as president. So it stepped up the pressure, but in a sense, Guaidó's attempt, or the opposition attempt in 2019, is quite similar to the previous attempt in one sense. All attempts to topple Maduro tried for a clean break. It's 100% change from Maduro in power to Maduro out. No in-between solutions were accepted. And this is common for using parliament, for using the recall referendum, for the mass demonstration, and for Guaidó's attempt. Now, why no compromise? Well, because this is a valid question, because negotiations often end authoritarian regime. But of course, the explanation is simple. The opposition is a coalition of many parties, of many conflicting individuals with personal ambitions. It's really hard to unite, and they could unite on one thing, which was this clean break, at least as long as you tried relatively democratic ways of getting to that clean break. And this creates problem for negotiations. We've seen many negotiation attempts in Venezuela over the years, not only since 2015, but also in the years before. And they have in common that they basically all failed in terms of removing Maduro or creating a democratic transition, because negotiation require compromise, and this is not an issue that the opposition agrees on. Some people are willing to compromise while others are not, and if you then enter negotiation, this means that the opposition splits, weakening the opposition, and by that also strengthening the regime when the regime enters negotiations. And this has been one of the reasons why, when we've seen negotiation attempts, either organized by Norway more recently, or formerly by the Catholic Church, or organized in the Dominican Republic, or where have you, you've seen that throughout these negotiations, popular mass demonstration and the pressure against the regime has been reduced. You've seen more infighting in the opposition, and at the same time, the position of the regime has been strengthened. So negotiations, even though I personally and normatively favor negotiation as a peaceful and good way of creating transition towards democracy, because I do think that stabilizes the situation that comes after, it has clearly been a strategy that has strengthened the Maduro regime in these last 5 years rather than weakened it. So now that the cycle has ended and Maduro is again in full control, at least institutionally controls parliament as well as the presidency into 2024, one might ask, what is new? Does this mean that all hope for a transition is lost? Or can we see potential changes or positive changes coming out of this? I would say that the situation now isn't that new, to the extent that the opposition never really had power, but the opposition has lost some potential levers or power of negotiation by not controlling the power of the purse that the control over parliament was. So There's a new situation that looks a lot like the old situation, which I think strengthened the regime to a certain extent, even though the state of Venezuela is, of course, a lot weaker than it was 5 years ago, as Benedicte has been talking about. And it also possibly requires new thinking from the opposition. Instead of going for a clean break, maybe there must be some reorientation towards winning smaller victories. That does not mean a transition to democracy, but may be victories that may help or alleviate the situation of the Venezuelan people. But my view of the situation right now is reminds me of Aslak's early words when introducing here, is that it's a very somber situation, and I do not see chances for an immediate or early radical change of the Venezuelan situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leiv. Erudite, as usual. Can I make 2 quick questions to you? And ask for, meaning asking for quick answers. There was an indication in the invitation to this meeting that the elections in last year were, despite a very low electoral turnout, somehow legitimizing Maduro's current presidency. I think I know the answer based on what you have said before, but could you please be clear about that?
Yeah, well, of course, the parliamentary election in December last year was also boycotted by large parts of the opposition. And the argument is quite fair. They say that the conditions aren't there to organize free and fair elections, of course, and the opposition made a choice to boycott in order to not legitimize the outcome. So it strengthens Maduro's position rather than legitimizing its position. But to a certain extent, there is a slight point there, because what the parliamentary election did was to weaken Guaido's position. Guaido's claim, even though it was a very legalistic claim, was connected to him being the president of parliament. And now, of course, parliament is renewed and Guaido is no longer a member of parliament. So I wouldn't say it legitimizes Maduro, but it really delegitimizes or weakens Guaido's claim to be the rightful president of Venezuela.
Thank you, Leiv. That was a good and nuanced answer. Now, I would like to ask you and Benedicte to comment on one term that we have been discussing for the last few years about the Venezuelan situation, and that is polarization. Judging from international media recollections of what is going on in Venezuela, it's easy to think that it's a situation of the government versus the opposition, as it was a sort of a binary situation. But for those who know Venezuela somewhat better, it's quite common to think about this not as a binary situation, but a situation of the Chavista government on one side and their supporters, the opposition on the other side and their supporter, and in the middle, a large group of people of varying size that are in Venezuela referred to as the ninis. That means the neither nor, not one nor the other. When a regime consolidates, like it has happened in the last year or 2 years, what does it, or an authoritarian regime rather consolidates, what does it mean in practice being in the opposition or in the neither nor group? Can you comment on that?
Benedicte, do you want to start?
I can start. Yeah, I think the term polarization maybe does not describe the situation in Venezuela as well as it used to do. I think we're talking about a fragmentation and a huge part of the electorate and the population that are just completely fed up with the situation. They want change. So the fact that they want change might put them on the part of the opposition side. Now, the numbers show the sort of polling numbers. Well, take it for what it is, but still, there's some pretty good polling institutes in Venezuela show that, for example, both Maduro and Guaidó have very low support as political leaders now. But there's also no other leaders that have a lot of support. So being, I think, for most people, whether they consider themselves ninis or opposition, it doesn't have a great impact on their daily life. Most people are just struggling to survive and get by. But what I can see, since I'm always a little bit more optimistic than Leiv, although it's safest to be really pessimistic when it's about Venezuela, then you're right in 99% of the cases. There is a kind of an attempt by all of those that do not feel represented by either the old opposition or the government to have a say and to try to move the situation, try to pressure the politicians to make a change. In the Foro Cívico that was established in February, and there's been some new attempts, particularly of negotiating a new electoral council to oversee the coming governmental, it's gobernadores, the governors elections that will be later this year. But yeah, I don't think the term polarization actually describes the situation in Venezuela right now.
Okay. Leiv?
Yeah, no, I think Benedicte make a very good point. I think one of the issues have been, of course, that if you look at which groups have been represented by political parties or political organization, if we call them the ninis or the non-aligned, have not had a very strong representation in terms of political parties. And of course, this is a group that has been going up and down a little bit, depending on how popular the opposition leaders have been. As Benedicte now say, Guaidó, who is maybe no longer the leader of the opposition, or at least not an undisputed leader, has become rather unpopular. And this, of course, creates a larger group of non-aligned. So, but I do think that alternative visions, if the group in between or a civil society organization that do not always seek that clean break that the opposition have been seeking. And I do think that one of the problems or challenges is to have these views represented by organized political actors that can actually become governors or become representatives in local or regional assemblies and in some years maybe national assemblies as well. So one thing is the pressure that civil society may come up with, but I also do think that there must also come some democratic or political organization that represent these views and not only provide pressure from the outside.
Yeah, thank you, Leiv. I can see now that there's going on a discussion in the questions and answers section. I don't think we will have time or being able to comment on all those issues. But there's a very concrete question about dollarization, and I'd like to take just that part. But then we'll spend the last quarter of an hour or so to return to the question of the negotiations, which also brings us to the current role of Norway. Now, just to take that dollarization part first, there's a question here: can we speak of dollarization when the government does not distribute dollars to the people who need it and for the people to use?
I think Benedicte is the dollarization. I just turn every question to you, Benedicte. I think that's the easiest way to do it.
Very generous.
For the listeners, dollarization is about de facto de facto transition from the domestic currency, which is the bolivar, to an ever more frequent usage of dollars as the means of exchange. De jure dollarization means that this is actually becoming ever more legal currency in the country. So I think that you said that both were going on.
Yeah, right. I think that there's different ways of understanding dollarization. Yes, it's not the formal currency of Venezuela. It's not like it is in Ecuador and El Salvador. That's clear. Some people think it should be, but it's not. I think in some sense, the dollarization started even before they lifted the currency controls, because people started to calculate prices in dollars because you couldn't calculate prices in bolivars. And then there is a gradual lifting of the prohibitions of doing private kind of change of currency. It used to be controlled by the state, and it was illegal to do that transaction. But and then gradually, and now recently, they allowed the opening of bank accounts in dollars in Venezuela. So it's a gradual acceptance of dollars as a kind of parallel currency in the country, which is of course not a formal dollarization. And yes, it's true that all wages are paid in bolivars, but so it's a system that creates a huge inequality. It's kind of resembling the parallel dollar system that you had in Cuba, and they're trying to get away from.
Thank you. I think we want to move over to the current developments and the negotiations that are going on. And apparently Norway or Norwegian diplomats is having a quite significant role in that game. Would you like to start enlighten us a little bit about that? Benedicte, I think you have some good insights in that, and then I'll ask Leiv to comment on the prospects of negotiations in general.
Me first?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, well, there are some signs that there are negotiations going on. Of course, Venezuelans tend to talk about everything. The Norwegian diplomats are always trying to keep things secret, but the clearer sign is perhaps that they've extended the deadline for proposing candidates for the Electoral Council. That's taken as a sign that there's actually negotiations about that Electoral Council going on as a first step.
Benedicte, what is the Electoral Council?
Okay, so that's a council that oversees elections, that oversees the rules of elections, acceptance of parties and candidates, and it's highly politicized. And there was also an attempted negotiations about that before the December election that broke down, and in the end the government intervened and just established one. So that's kind of, it doesn't seem like a huge thing, but I would say that the format of negotiations seems to have changed from the negotiations in 2019 that was brokered by the Norwegians, that had the idea of kind of the major goal was to organize new presidential elections and to start anew from that. And then there was a lot of discussion whether Maduro could be in or out and all of that. And it was kind of two clear parties. It was the Guaidó camp and the Maduro government. As we all know, that broke down for many reasons. But there's two things that have happened lately, and one is that the probable negotiations about the Electoral Council, and the other is an agreement between Guaidó and the Maduro government of the purchase of vaccines with the funds that has been frozen in the United States due to the recognition of Guaidó as the legitimate president by the United States. Now that is there's a lot of criticism of that, and when this is something that, of course, the government should have purchased vaccines, and should have had that already, and all of that. But it's little signs. And there's another sign that I think I think it's important also, of course, to talk about the role of the United States here. And I think that the Trump administration played an extremely unconstructive role related to all kinds of attempts to find a solution in Venezuela. They imposed new sanctions, but more importantly, I would say they failed to link those sanctions directly to what could make them remove the sanctions in terms of a solution. So it was very unclear, sort of save the from one day to another that the Maduro government just resigned, which of course is not going to happen. It was very unclear what would sanctions relief require. Now there's definitely movements in the United States to link some of those sanctions, sanction alleviation to some improvement, some kind of negotiated solutions. I think the first that could happen is that they reintroduce the crude for diesel swaps. That would be very important for the humanitarian situation in Venezuela right now. The role of the Norwegians, they've been there all the time. They've been back and forth and try to negotiate within the opposition, try to discuss to bring other parts together. But I think it's very important to remember about the role of Norway, that Norway can be kind of what they love to talk about themselves as a tilrettelegger, the kind of can be the little drop that maybe tilts the glass, or sort of one little part of a big game, but they're not the big game. So there's a lot of other international actors here that are that kind of put the parts of this puzzle, and then the Norwegians are sometimes good at trying to bring some of the pieces together, I think. And now there's changes in Europe, there's changes in Latin America. The most recent thing that happened was that Argentina left the Lima group. That has been very kind of more on the hardliner side. So
Benedicte?
I think there's movement.
Yeah. I'd like to turn the word back to Leiv here. Norway, in a way, has renunciated its voice in the criticism of the Venezuelan regime, much to the difference of many other European countries, or what should I say, Western countries, and that seems to be absolutely linked to the role Norway is trying to play in the negotiations. But Leiv, you have previously published and analyzed the prospects of a negotiated solution in Venezuela, and expressed some skepticism about that possibility. Can you please repeat a few of those arguments and say what that would mean for the Norwegian position?
Yeah, well, I basically said that I do think that a negotiated solution, meaning a negotiation that negotiates Maduro out of power, is next to impossible, given that the opposition is not strong enough, and there's not enough international pressure to incentivize Maduro to leave. Now, there's been some change of tactics, it seems, and Benedicte mentioned these, to negotiate on smaller issues, be that relief of some sanctions, be that in terms of vaccines or the composition of the electoral organs. Well, that is possible. But it's very hard to negotiate. It's very difficult to see why Maduro and his supporters would negotiate their way out of power as long as they control the state as they do, and as long as they control and have control over the military forces. There's nothing that the opposition can offer for them to leave. They face potential court cases in the future, either in Venezuela for a violation of human rights, or internationally. So it's very hard to see that Maduro or his supporters would willingly let themselves negotiate their way out of power. And at the moment, of course, the opposition is in no position to force them out of power, being weaker than ever before. And when they didn't succeed in the 2015 to 2020 period, it's really hard for me to see. Now, could they agree upon smaller issues? Yes, definitely. But the key issue, of course, is who controls the presidency here. And that is also the key issue that they couldn't agree upon, namely holding presidential elections a year or 2 or 3 back, whereas they could agree upon many on the other minor issues when Norway was negotiating or helping the negotiations between the opposition and the regime. So I do think negotiations that are ongoing are positive and possible, but the key question, facilitating a democratic transition, that is very hard to see unless there is a real split in the regime, competition for power coming up towards the next presidential election. For instance, someone wants to challenge Maduro. That could change the position, but as long as the regime remains united, it's very hard to see that any such negotiations could succeed at all. We've seen few examples of successful negotiated transitions to democracy in countries that have the conditions that Venezuela have at the moment.
Yeah, so that answers one of the questions in the chat here, which is about is the regime interested in solving the conflict? And the way I interpret you, it's interested in, no, the question is the regime interested in solving the conflict through negotiations?
Well, I think they would be interested in solving some conflicts through negotiations, any conflict through negotiation, as long as it doesn't mean them leaving power. Of course, the regime is interested in solving conflicts that could help it relieve sanctions or remove sanctions, but no negotiation. If the conflict is on who controls the presidency, then no. On every other issue, then yes.
So in a way, they're interested in negotiating, but not ending the negotiations.
Yeah, you might say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Any for a comment to that, Benedicte? Last comment.
Yeah, I think some of the issues is that if you look at the literature and the historical experiences, there's very little kind of that, as Leiv said, you don't have a lot of very successful cases of negotiating an authoritarian government out of power, but you also have almost no kind of successful experiences of sanctions pressing a government, an authoritarian government out of power. It's a bit the same, that you can achieve something with sanctions, but there's almost zero success rate in getting an authoritarian government out of power. It's rather the opposite. It consolidates authoritarian governments while leading to a criminalization of the economy. So in a sense, the two options that have been on the table have both very little chances of succeed. And then what's left? That's kind of the big question. I think we are also, everybody's very sort of other options that were on the table during the Trump administration is absolutely, would lead to a catastrophe. So we're left with kind of popular mobilization, which is also which is just the start of something. As Leiv mentioned, I mean, you can have a pressure by civil society and a lot of, but you still need some political solution to make the change in the end. And that is the big, the really big issue.
Leiv, you asked for a comment?
Yeah, it's just that one of the issues that Benedicte mentioned, of course, is the criminalization that we've seen in Venezuela over years. And this is also something that really complicates finding a negotiated solution, because the regime has so much more to lose when they are supported by criminal actors or engaged in illicit activities that Benedicte had been mentioning also in her introduction. So the changing nature of the regime over the last 5, 6, or even years before that, towards increasing criminalization, towards increasing illicit activities, corruption, so on and so forth, also makes negotiations on a transition all the more difficult in a way. And just wanted to highlight that as well, because this is a very important factor that complicates negotiations.
So we're getting towards the end here, but I would like just the term criminalization brings us to it's a cue to something that I would like us to have explored more, but we're going to have to leave for another day. But just a quick comment, a few comments on that from the two of you. Benedicte mentioned criminalization of the economy. Now, we know from various reports that there has been a criminalization of the economy, that there has been links between the regime and human rights abuses. It's been firmly documented. There is a humanitarian disaster situation, and there is also in large parts of the country a fairly unknown ecological disaster going on in the Arco Minero, the mining areas of the country, and also problems linked to the oil industry. And it's almost as if the regime doesn't care, as long as it stays in power, about all those negative developments. So that brings the question, have we also seen not only the criminalization of the economy, but also the criminalization of the political regime in power in Caracas, or sort of the criminalization of the Chavista regime? Would you like to have a few pointed comments on that, the two of you?
Who starts? Of course it's been a criminalization of the regime. The question is, how do you coin that with a concept? But clearly over time there's been an increasing criminalization, an increasing engagement with illegal groups and actors, and also violent groups. And this has been a strategy for survival, of course, as the regime has had to concentrate its hold on power, and it's been losing resources through the economic crisis that Benedicte has been talking about. It seeks new allies for survival. So yes, if it's a criminal regime, I don't know how to coin it, but we've seen an increase in alliances between the Maduro regime and criminal actors, and that has had grave human rights consequences. We've seen grave environmental consequences in the Arco Minero, and it's been a strategy in a sense for survival during the hard pressure that the opposition put on the regime over the last 5 to 6 years, and during the increasing economic crisis that Benedicte has talked about, which has led the regime to seek new venues for income and so on and so forth. So yes.
Benedicte, last comment.
Yeah, I think definitely that's part of the issue, and that is something that complicates, of course, any negotiations. I see there's a lot of questions in the chat and the Q&A here about whether can you negotiate with criminals. I think that I'm not really sure if the legalistic way is the way out of this strategy, because this crisis, I think it needs to be a political deal, and I think you are going to have to crack a lot of eggs to make an omelette, if you're going to make an omelette in this case. So I'm not so convinced that the legalistic part, the way to solve this is the right one. But of course, in a kind of process in the future, you would also need to have some means of kind of looking at what happened, because there's so many people that are killed, there are so many people that have gotten their lives ruined, that just kind of let's move on from here now and start with, that's also very difficult. But if you look at the experiences, these are so delicate issues. So I think there can be a lot of pressure from like human rights organizations abroad. I think that's really important. Also the UN, but I still think that you need to find a political solution to this.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Benedicte. And thank you very much, Leiv, for all your insights, your presentations, and very insightful answers to the questions, also coming from the audience. That's as far as we got today. There's no way we could have covered all the areas that we would have liked to discuss, and I presume that we will continue these discussions in a scholarly fashion, and also in civil society debates going on in the media, and whenever we can meet physically. I think it's, I see that there's a lot of debate going on in the questions or the chat room here. That is a sign of the times. We are getting used to parallel discussions going on in the chat rooms of our webinars. There's no way we can, it's sort of hard to interact with that regularly, but I'm grateful that you're doing it, and we'll just have to pick up some of those questions at a later point. And also the heated debates going on in the chat room is also a sign or a symptom of the debate that's going on and around Venezuelan issues globally. So with that, once again, thank you very much, Leiv. Thank you very much, Benedicte. And thank you to the organizers at Bergen Global. And have a good morning.